So this all occurred starting AD 65 going up through AD 66. Okay? And another thing that happened from the spring of AD 66, around May, which would have been around Passover time, going through to the fall of AD 66, was that there were a lot of skirmishes and wars between the Jews themselves and also the Jews to the Romans, attacks back and forth. It was like an unsafe time. So a number of Christians had left because of persecution earlier, but this also was an opportune time to, before this, to have gotten out before Civil War and a lot of these other things started to happen. And this was before the first siege. Okay, so just kind of get the flavor of that. So then, a week before Cestius surrounded Jerusalem, which was on November 7 of AD 66, was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So any Christians or Jewish Christians living in Jerusalem would have participated in the fasting and prayers with Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement. Okay, so you think about what that must have felt like to them, because they could tell the things happening around them. They were watching the signs. And then the Feast of Tabernacles came. This would have been the 15th day of the 7th month. The Day of Atonement was the 10th day of the 7th month, okay? So the first siege occurred around, let me show you the date here, November 7, AD 66 to November 22nd of AD 66. And Cestius surrounded Jerusalem on November 7, and he penetrated the outer wall. So there's a sign. He penetrated the outer wall. This was considered a sacred area. Romans were viewed as abominations, pagan, filthy. They weren't viewed in a positive way by the Jews, and that here he was entering a sacred area. Then he waited at the wall for 3 to 5 days, and then on November 22nd of AD 66, he was at the north wall, and he withdrew. He was at the north temple wall. So here he was at the outer wall on November 7, and on November 22nd, he was at the north temple wall. So there's two different signs there, on the outer wall and then at the north temple wall, okay? And there were a number of things that were happening during this. So Cestius in AD 66 on November 7 got to Jerusalem, penetrated to the outer wall. Then by November 22nd, he penetrated through to the north wall, the north temple wall. And then he suddenly withdrew. Why? It's a question that no historian really answers. So, a couple of things about that that I found interesting were that sometime between November 7 and November 22nd, Jewish leaders were trying to get the Romans to step in to take control of other Jewish factions. So there was this interweaving of political stuff between those who were Jewish leaders that were in power and the Romans. So it was to the Romans' benefit to try to cooperate with that, as well as to the leaders, right? They had reason to do that. So, but by the time of November 22nd, the high priest was killed. So there was a lot of intrigue around that, and all of a sudden the political power structure changed. Also, between the spring of AD 66 and going up through to the siege by General Cestius in November, you know, there were at least, wait a minute, let me repeat that again. There were 4 different civil wars that occurred from the time of the siege by Cestius up to the time of the siege by General Titus. 4 civil wars within Jerusalem, within the Jewish culture. These were from factions like the Sadducees and the Pharisees and other factions. The Zealots were especially powerful more towards the end with the destruction of Jerusalem or leading up to that, you know. So they were fighting. So here we have a key Jewish figure, a high priest that was killed, murdered before November 22nd, and all of a sudden Cestius withdraws. So history doesn't really know why, but that is one of the events that happened around that time. It makes me wonder. It certainly points to a lot of the political intrigue and the civil wars and the different fighting that was going on and stuff, you know, much like we see now in a lot of our cities. So that happened as he was withdrawing. This was actually on the Sabbath. And remember how Jesus in Matthew 24 and those places said, pray that your flight be not on the Sabbath? Well, their flight may have ended up being on the Sabbath or maybe the day after, because the Jews attacked the Romans on the Sabbath. They forgot it was Sabbath. They were so enraged. 6,000 Romans were killed by the Jews in that attack. There were only 22 Jews who died. History records that the Jews that died, the 22 Jews, were known heroes, strong fighters and warriors. So that occurred. And then we have this time leading between AD 66 to AD 70 where there were 4 civil wars among the Jews. So another thing that happened was that Cestius went back to Rome in disgrace, and then he suddenly died, and history doesn't really record how he died or what happened, but there's suspicion that Nero had him killed. So then here we are, AD 66 through to AD 70, and there's 4 civil wars. It was really hard for anyone to escape Jerusalem, get out during that time. It wasn't totally impossible. So definitely when Cestius withdrew, that was the sign that for those who were watching for that sign, they left. History records that there was not a single Christian who died in the siege in AD 70. So what were the signs that they saw? Remember, we talked about the armies were standing in the holy place. They were standing where they ought not. And that was the sign to flee. Okay? The Roman armies also surrounded Jerusalem. This was the first time that they surrounded Jerusalem. And there's some things we can learn from this. Okay, one is the signs were visual. Everyone could see them. And then those who were following Jesus or familiar with the prophecies and things he said were aware of that, and they had that witness also. But there were visual signs for people to see during this time. Then there was the persecution that had been prophesied. Then there was the first siege. There was the sign of the outer wall. There was then the delay between the time that Cestius got to the outer wall and the time that he went to the north temple wall and then withdrew. So those are some things we can learn from. Are we watching the signs? There are many people in other cultures and religions who watch the signs who would have noticed these things and paid attention to them. There are people in other cultures that follow prophecies in their cultures. So I'm just pointing that out. when Cestius withdrew from Jerusalem, and at that time he was attacked by the Jews. 6,000 Romans were killed in that attack, and 22 Jews who were strong warriors. And the Zealots took a strong part in that attack of the Romans. So I want to describe how things were for those who stayed in Jerusalem. The Christians had left because of Cestius' withdrawal and because that fit the signs that Jesus had predicted. But many people stayed in Jerusalem who were not Christians, so and weren't followers of those beliefs. So during this time, from AD 66 until AD 70, there were 4 civil wars between the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Zealots, and several other factions. There was a lot of intrigue with one high priest killed his uncle and his father, and all this intrigue and different murders that occurred in taking power happened clear up until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Ending with before the destruction of Jerusalem, the Zealots gained power for a period of time. So, so then in AD 67, General Vespasian invaded Jerusalem, and he had been handpicked by Nero, and he was handpicked by Nero on January 8 of AD 67, and 3.5 years later, after Nero had picked him to take on the quote-unquote problem in Jerusalem, that was when Jerusalem was destroyed. Exactly 3.5 years later. History records that. I thought that was interesting. And it's possible he actually went into Jerusalem as early as December. There's a lot of varying dates on this, and I'm giving the best dates I could find when I researched this. Sometimes the historians don't agree. So he invaded Jerusalem, and he invaded a lot of the cities around Jerusalem. And so that was also a siege. So it was a good thing that those people who followed the prophecies of Christ had left when they saw those signs with Cestius, with General Cestius, because I don't see that there was much, if any, time after that they could have left, not with all the civil wars, and then Vespasian coming in soon after that, and you know, it would have been really hard, and maybe, I don't know if it was impossible, but it was really hard. Would have been really hard. You would have been risking your life. So then, you know, on June 9 of AD 68, Nero committed suicide. No Roman emperor had ever done that before, but Nero was a flamboyant person with a lot of different problems. So anyway, he committed suicide. So then in the year of AD 68 is called the year of the 4 emperors. And the reason was because there were 4 different emperors and different fighting and political stuff trying to figure out who was going to, you know, be the emperor. And somewhere in there, Agrippa, who was the King Agrippa from the Bible, was involved. I don't know exactly how, but I read about that a little bit. Anyway, with these 4 emperors, it ended up that Vespasian ended up being the emperor. And he picked his son, who was Titus, to become general of the armies around Jerusalem. He trusted Titus. Titus wasn't exactly wasn't a strong general like his father was, but Vespasian trusted him. So that's what happened. Now, there's another topic that we need to explore with this, and that is what happened. Why during this time did so many people not leave Jerusalem.